Every empire believes its money will last forever. Every nation convinces itself that its currency is different, stronger, more permanent than all those that came before. And every single time, history laughs at that arrogance, because there is a pattern that repeats with mechanical precision across centuries, across continents, across civilizations. Reserve currencies rise and fall through 6 predictable stages, and understanding these stages isn't just academic curiosity, it's survival knowledge. Because right now, the US dollar is sitting squarely in stage 4, and what comes next will reshape the global economy in ways most people cannot imagine. The cycle always begins the same way. A nation emerges from war, revolution, or economic chaos with something the world desperately needs: stability. Their currency becomes trusted not because it's backed by gold or silver, but because it's backed by strength. Military strength, economic strength, political strength. The world looks at this nation and says, we can trust them to honor their promises. We can store our wealth in their money. We can trade using their currency as the universal language of commerce. And so a reserve currency is born. But here's what every rising power forgets. Becoming the world's reserve currency is not a prize. It's a trap. Because once your money becomes everyone else's money, you lose control over your own fate. Your domestic policies become global policies. Your economic mistakes become global mistakes. And eventually, the very privilege that made you powerful becomes the weight that crushes you. Stage 1 is ascendance through strength. This is where a nation builds the foundation that will support its currency for decades to come. They win wars, dominate trade routes, and create economic systems so efficient that other countries want to copy them. Britain reached this stage after defeating Napoleon, when the Royal Navy controlled the seas and London became the world's financial center. The United States achieved it after World War II, when American factories supplied a devastated world and the dollar became anchored to gold at Bretton Woods. During stage 1, everything feels inevitable. The rising power looks at history and thinks they've cracked the code. They've learned from the mistakes of previous empires. Their system is different, more sophisticated, more permanent. They build institutions, sign treaties, and create economic arrangements that seem designed to last forever. The pound sterling was once so dominant that people called it simply sterling, as if no other currency mattered. The dollar achieved something even more remarkable. It became the only currency you could use to buy oil from most of the world's producers. But stage 1 contains the seeds of its own destruction. Because the stronger your currency becomes, the more other nations depend on it, and dependency breeds resentment. Trade partners begin to notice that they're essentially funding your lifestyle, your military, your global influence with their labor and resources. They start asking uncomfortable questions. Why should we accept your paper in exchange for our oil, our manufactured goods, our raw materials? Why should your central bank's decisions determine our economic fate? Stage 2 is the golden age of privilege. This is where the reserve currency nation discovers the intoxicating power of being able to print money that the world will accept. They realize they can run trade deficits that would bankrupt any other country. They can fund wars, social programs, and massive government projects simply by creating currency out of thin air. Other nations have to earn foreign currency through exports, through savings, through painful economic discipline. The reserve currency nation just prints more. Britain enjoyed this privilege for over a century. London banks could finance global trade, fund colonial adventures, and support domestic prosperity all through the magic of printing pounds that the world would accept. The United States has lived in this stage since the 1970s, when Nixon ended the dollar's convertibility to gold. Suddenly, America could fund massive military spending, consumer imports, and government programs without the constraint of having to balance its books with other nations. During stage 2, economists and politicians celebrate this arrangement as the natural order. They call it financial innovation, global integration, the triumph of market efficiency. They point to the benefits. Global trade flows more smoothly, international commerce is easier, and the reserve currency nation becomes incredibly wealthy. American consumers can buy products from around the world at artificially low prices. The government can fund a global military presence without raising taxes. It feels like winning the economic lottery. But stage 2 is built on a fundamental lie that other nations will accept this arrangement forever, that they will continue shipping real goods, real resources, real labor in exchange for currency that costs nothing to produce. History shows this assumption is always wrong. The privilege creates imbalances that grow larger every year. The reserve currency nation imports more than it exports, borrows more than it saves, and consumes more than it produces. Meanwhile, other countries accumulate massive reserves of this currency, effectively lending their wealth to fund someone else's lifestyle. Stage 3 is where the cracks begin to show. The mathematics of stage 2 are unsustainable, and eventually reality asserts itself. The reserve currency nation finds itself drowning in debt, both public and private. Their trade deficits become so large that they represent a significant portion of global commerce. Their currency's value starts to depend not on the strength of their economy, but on the continued willingness of other nations to accept and hold their money. Britain reached stage 3 during the early 20th century, as the costs of 2 world wars and a global empire became impossible to finance through traditional means. The pound weakened, Britain's trade position deteriorated, and other nations began to question whether London could maintain its role as the world's financial center. The United States entered stage 3 in the 1970s, when persistent inflation and growing trade deficits forced Nixon to abandon the gold standard and devalue the dollar. During stage 3, the reserve currency nation faces a cruel paradox. They need to strengthen their currency to maintain global confidence, but strengthening their currency makes their exports less competitive and their trade deficits larger. They need to reduce their trade deficits, but doing so would require reducing imports, which would lower living standards and create domestic political problems. They need to reduce government spending to control debt, but reducing spending could trigger a recession that would make their debt problems worse. Most importantly, stage 3 is where alternative currencies begin to emerge. Other nations start to realize that the current system is not working in their favor. They begin creating bilateral trade agreements that bypass the reserve currency. They start accumulating gold, developing digital currencies, or building economic blocs that reduce their dependence on the dominant monetary system. These alternatives start small, dismissed as curiosities or threats to global stability, but they represent the early signs of a fundamental shift. Stage 4 is active displacement. This is where the world stops pretending that the current system is permanent and begins actively building alternatives. Multiple currencies compete for global influence. Regional monetary systems emerge. Trade agreements explicitly exclude the former reserve currency. What once seemed like isolated experiments become coordinated strategies to reduce dependence on the dominant monetary power. The signs of stage 4 are unmistakable once you know what to look for. Central banks around the world start diversifying their reserves away from the dominant currency. International trade agreements begin settling in alternatives. New institutions emerge to compete with the financial systems controlled by the reserve currency nation. The dominant power finds itself fighting to maintain relevance rather than taking its privilege for granted. And this is exactly where the United States finds itself today. China and Russia settle oil trades in yuan and rubles. European nations explore alternatives to dollar-based payment systems. Central banks accumulate gold at the fastest pace in decades. The BRICS nations discuss creating their own reserve currency. Digital currencies threaten to bypass traditional monetary systems entirely. The dollar is no longer rising through strength or enjoying unchallenged privilege. It is being actively displaced by nations that have grown tired of funding American consumption, American military adventures, and American monetary policy. The question is not whether this displacement will continue. The question is how quickly it will accelerate and what comes next. Because history shows us that stage 4 is not the end of the cycle. It is the beginning of the most dangerous phase, where the former reserve currency nation faces a choice that will determine not just their economic future, but their survival as a global power. Stage 5 is financial desperation, and this is where empires reveal their true character. When a nation realizes that their monetary privilege is slipping away, when other powers are building systems designed to exclude them, when their currency faces genuine competition for the first time in generations, they face a moment of truth. They can accept the new reality gracefully, managing their decline with dignity and wisdom, or they can fight to preserve their privilege through increasingly desperate measures that only accelerate their downfall. History shows us which path most reserve currency powers choose. Britain in the 1960s tried everything to preserve the pound's status. They imposed capital controls, restricted gold purchases, and begged other nations to continue holding sterling. They created elaborate financial schemes to make their currency appear stronger than it actually was. They leveraged their remaining political influence to pressure allies into supporting an obviously failing system. And when those measures failed, they devalued the pound repeatedly, each time destroying a little more credibility, a little more trust. The desperation of stage 5 manifests in predictable ways. The declining power starts manipulating their currency more aggressively, trying to maintain competitiveness while preserving international confidence. They impose controls on capital flows, restricting their own citizens' ability to move money abroad. They pressure allies and trading partners to continue using their currency, threatening economic retaliation against nations that seek alternatives. They weaponize their remaining financial influence, using sanctions and payment system exclusions as tools of foreign policy. These tactics backfire spectacularly. Every act of financial coercion provides other nations with more reasons to build alternative systems. Every manipulation of currency markets reduces trust in the system's fairness. Every restriction on capital flows demonstrates that the former reserve currency is no longer freely convertible, no longer truly reliable. The harder they fight to maintain their privilege, the faster other nations work to escape their control. The United States is already showing early signs of stage 5 behavior. Washington has weaponized the dollar-based payment system, cutting entire nations off from international commerce through sanctions. They've pressured allies to avoid Chinese payment systems and Russian energy markets. They've used their control over global banking to monitor and restrict transactions that have nothing to do with American interests. Each of these actions provides other nations with compelling reasons to develop systems that cannot be controlled by Washington. The Federal Reserve's response to recent crises has been particularly revealing. They've created trillions of dollars out of thin air, first during the 2008 financial crisis, then again during the pandemic. These actions may have prevented immediate collapse, but they've also demonstrated to the world that the dollar's value depends entirely on American political decisions. Foreign central banks holding dollars have watched their reserves lose purchasing power, while American asset prices soared. The message is clear. Holding dollars means accepting whatever monetary policy serves American interests, regardless of how it affects everyone else. Meanwhile, the alternatives are becoming more sophisticated every year. China's digital yuan allows international transactions without touching the dollar system. Russia and India trade oil in rupees and rubles, cutting American banks out of the process entirely. European nations have created payment channels that can operate independently of American financial infrastructure. These aren't just backup systems anymore. They're becoming primary channels for major economic powers. But Stage 5 contains a particularly dangerous trap. As the reserve currency nation becomes more desperate, they often resort to military action to preserve their economic privilege. Britain used military force repeatedly to defend the pound's status, from the Suez Crisis to interventions across their former empire. The logic seems compelling to desperate leaders. If economic coercion isn't working, perhaps military pressure will convince other nations to maintain the existing system. This is where Stage 5 becomes genuinely frightening for global stability. A declining reserve currency power still possesses massive military capabilities, intelligence networks, and alliance structures built during their period of dominance. They can cause enormous damage even as their economic foundations crumble. The temptation to use force to preserve privilege becomes overwhelming when leaders realize their nation's entire way of life depends on monetary arrangements that are rapidly disappearing. The signs are already visible in American foreign policy. Military interventions in oil-producing regions, pressure campaigns against nations developing alternative payment systems, and alliance structures designed to contain economic competitors all reflect the logic of Stage 5 thinking. Washington's response to China's Belt and Road Initiative, Russia's energy partnerships, and even Europe's modest attempts at financial independence suggests a nation that views economic alternatives as existential threats requiring forceful responses. Stage 5 is also characterized by internal political upheaval. Citizens begin to understand that their government's promises cannot be kept without the monetary privilege their nation is losing. Social programs become unaffordable. Military commitments cannot be sustained. The standard of living that seemed like a birthright starts to decline. Political leaders who built their careers on the assumption of permanent monetary dominance find themselves managing decline instead of growth. The domestic politics become vicious as different groups fight over shrinking resources. Some demand that the government fight harder to preserve their currency's status, regardless of the costs. Others argue for accepting reality and adapting to a multipolar monetary world. The debate often tears nations apart, creating the kind of internal instability that accelerates external challenges to their currency's status. Britain experienced this during the 1970s, as economic decline combined with political chaos created a sense that the nation was becoming ungovernable. Industrial strikes, currency crises, and political deadlock convinced many observers that British democracy itself might not survive the transition away from monetary privilege. The United States is already showing similar strains, with political polarization reaching levels not seen since the Civil War, and economic inequality creating social tensions that threaten institutional stability. The tragedy of Stage 5 is that the very actions taken to preserve monetary privilege guarantee its loss. Every desperate measure confirms to the watching world that the former reserve currency is no longer reliable, no longer trustworthy, no longer deserving of its special status. The harder they fight, the faster alternatives develop. The more they weaponize their currency, the more other nations want to escape their control. But Stage 5 is not just about the declining powers' mistakes. It's also about the rising powers learning to coordinate their alternatives. During Britain's decline, the United States was ready to step in with a fully developed alternative system. Today's transition is more complex because no single nation is ready to replace American monetary dominance entirely. Instead, we're seeing the emergence of multiple competing systems, regional arrangements, and technological solutions that could fragment the global monetary system in unprecedented ways. So here we stand at the crossroads of monetary history. The dollar sits in Stage 4, with Stage 5 looming like a storm on the horizon. The six-stage cycle that has governed reserve currencies for centuries is playing out in real time, and most people don't even realize they're watching the end of an era. The pattern is clear, the timeline is accelerating, and the outcome is inevitable. Every reserve currency that has ever existed has followed this same path. The pound sterling, once so dominant it needed no other name, now trades as a regional currency. The Spanish pieces of 8, the Dutch guilder, the French franc during its brief moment of European dominance, all followed the same arc from strength to privilege to desperation to replacement. The question isn't whether the dollar will maintain its reserve status forever. History has already answered that question. The question is what comes next. and whether you'll be ready for a world where American monetary privilege is just another chapter in the textbook of dead empires. Understanding these stages isn't about predicting the future, it's about recognizing the present. And right now, the present is telling us that the greatest monetary transition in modern history is already underway.